Fraser Cameron, the EU-Russia Centre. On conditionality first, we're not very good at it. There's many examples, for example, of countries pretty close to us in North Africa with whom we have agreements, and there's a clause to suspend human rights when there are abuses there. We've never used it. Never used it. We're quite good at imposing sanctions in faraway countries like Fiji or Burma, but closer to our shores, we're not very good. Romania and Bulgaria, did we impose real conditionality before they joined? No, we did not. We didn't even follow our own principles when Cyprus joined. One of our criteria was not taking in a country which had not resolved its border problems. So we're not very good at conditionality is the point. And unless you actually have the carrot of membership, the experience shows it doesn't work. I want to come to the narrative, the big narrative. And here's the real question for the panel. Why don't we actually set out the goal over a 10-year period of having a revived transatlantic relation based on the old Kennedy principles of a twin-pillar alliance, i.e. we would dissolve the actual military structure of NATO per se, because it simply doesn't resonate with young people today, NATO, but we have a new relationship between an enlarged and deepened European Union and the United States. That would be the basis of the relationship, which we would both agree to work to over a 10-year period. Because it's fanciful, at 60, 70 years after the end of the Cold War, we still actually have one power defending Europe against what threat? Let's grow up. Let's have a grown-up adult relationship between Europe and the United States.
I think this deserves an answer rather than taking a group of questions. Anybody want to take this up immediately? Fabrice and Nick? Nick first, yes?
I mean, to an extent, I sympathize with that last point, Fraser, but I don't think it's an either-or. I mean, yes, palpably, NATO is less relevant today than it was in the days of the Cold War, and frankly, I think it's going to become increasingly less salient to the immediate security problems that people actually want to address, which are organized crime and energy dependencies and frozen conflicts in Europe. But I think that it is fundamental to hang on to the ultimate US security guarantee to Europe, because it reminds me of those signs you used to see in New York where on the wall or opposite some attractive place to put your car, don't even think of parking here. And that security guarantee to the security and stability of Europe, which is embodied in NATO, I think is fundamental to avoid any kind of revisionism and so on. But we must accept that increasingly the EU should be taking up more of the burden of dealing with the practical day-to-day, more immediate security issues that resonate with the public and occupy the minds of politicians and everybody else.
Giving up the security guarantee is the same.
Microphone, please. Sorry.
So I'm not arguing give up the security guarantee, Nick. It's revising it so the relationship is actually between the EU and the US, not between the individual member states.
Oh, I see. Well, if the EU and NATO could talk to each other, that would change matters.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I wanted to say, I mean, we have a window of opportunity now because all the governments have to be very restrictive about defense spending. So perhaps this is the only window of opportunity we have to build a genuine CSDP, and then perhaps finally NATO or two Cartier and Brussels could talk to each other, because this is really becoming.
Yeah, but talk for what? I think. Yes, I think we all agree that they should have a closer cooperation, but I think we need to be more realistic about what that cooperation can deliver. I'm not sure whether it can deliver a game changer. I think the EU is still in the midst of this Lisbon Treaty implementation, which is so far quite ugly, but hopefully will produce a kind of new EU. But we are very far from having a fully integrated security effort within the EU. So if the NATO and EU need to talk about having better operational agreements on the ground in Afghanistan, in the Balkans, yes, I think that makes sense. But about the EU taking on more of the security burden in Europe itself, I'm not sure whether this is something that will happen in the coming decade. So I think it doesn't mean it should not happen, it just means we have to also be realistic about that prospect. And just to respond to Fraser's point, despite the onus being on NATO to transform itself, I think that the onus is on everybody to transform itself. So NATO is not the only one. NATO still holds, I think, a huge comparative advantage, which is it's the only fully integrated military structure. And until we find a replacement to that, until we find the same type of security standards that NATO troops have, I think NATO still has a high relevance.
A quick comment. Thank you, Fabrice.
Yes, hopefully not in the next 3 years, right? But the problem is, I think, that the problem is that this world is encouraging individual action parallel to the action within the institutions which was dominant in the bipolar world. Europe understood that if it wants to keep a voice in the decision-making game, has to unite. And actually, after the war, it united. Now, it's a different world in which the individual countries would feel that they have a chance on their own, in parallel with the institutions. And therefore, you see, that's exactly why we have these summits on security matters outside both NATO and the EU. And I think, that the institutions cannot function unless the member countries want them to function. So I think, that this is where the problem is.
As a moderator, I'm going to bite my tongue.